I am Taylor Smurl, and this is Neat! Alright, so this week we're talking about Buffalo Trace. Now, over on the podcast, we got into the history of the Buffalo Trace Distillery, one of the oldest distilleries in America, if not the oldest distillery in America. There's debate. They make a ton of really good products, one of which is their flagship Buffalo Trace Bourbon. The reason we're talking about this is because it's spooky month and the Buffalo Trace Distillery is super haunted. So we're gonna mix some spirits with some spirits and make some drinks with Buffalo Trace. So before I get into that, I always love to give a rundown about what a bottle tells us about what's inside. Right away, Buffalo Trace says it's a Kentucky straight bourbon whiskey. Now, whereas some words in the alcohol world are a little bit less informative, like vodka, gin, rum, that's just kind of telling you vaguely what might be included and vaguely what it might taste like. When you see the word bourbon on a label, you know a lot of rules have been followed. There are specific things you have to do to get your spirit labeled as bourbon. Your mash bill has to be at least 51% corn. You have to age your spirit in new American oak barrels. You cannot add any colorant, any flavoring. The only additive you can put in this is water to proof it down. Speaking to proof, it's gotta go into the cask at no more than 125 proof, and it's gotta go into the bottle at no less than 80 proof. And it's gotta be made in America, not Kentucky. It's gotta be made in America. Now, to be called Kentucky bourbon, it does have to be made in Kentucky, which sounds obvious, but there's actually a pretty long history of spirits saying they're made someplace and then actually being from another place. So Kentucky went out of its way to get that legislated, which is good for it. It's good. There are two areas within that rule of bourbon that are sort of where the wiggle room comes in as far as a quality is concerned. One is in the mash bill. Like I said, it has to be 51% corn, but that other 49% can be from anything. It can be more corn, it can be rye, it can be wheat, it can be barley, malted barley. Any of those can make a superior high quality bourbon, but it's good to know, they're gonna all taste very different. So that's something to investigate. If you're a fan of bourbon, but maybe you like one bourbon more than another, look into the mash build. As far as Buffalo Trace is concerned, while they're not completely forward about their mash build, it's estimated to be upwards of 90% corn. So it's a very corn forward bourbon. The other area of wiggle room is the age statement. So like I mentioned, it has to be aged in new American oak to be called bourbon. But nobody says how long. So really I could take my completely unaged whiskey off my still, wheel it across my warehouse in a barrel and call it bourbon. Nobody's gonna do that because the only way you get any color in your whiskey is from the barrel. If it's called bourbon, like I said, you can't add colorants or flavorings, but there's not an implication of how long it's aged. Now, the word straight here, straight bourbon, implies at least 2 years, so that's a quality assurance. Buffalo Trace in itself is aged somewhere between 6 to 8 years. Now, there's not a direct correlation between quality and age statement. I don't want you to think that's true. But there is typically a correlation between age statement and cost. And my dad made a good point on the podcast, and that's that the longer a barrel sits in a warehouse, the more taxes you have to pay on that. So if you love a 10-year whiskey, but they have a 12-year, and you're like, maybe I'll love the 12-year better, but it's more expensive, it might only be more expensive because it's set in that rick house a little longer. So now that we understand what's in our bottle, let's make a drink. A classic bourbon cocktail that I don't think we've ever brought up on this show before is something called the Brown Derby. And that's gonna be the basis for the cocktail I'm gonna make today. Now, it would be really cool if the Brown Derby related to the Kentucky Derby, because we're talking about Kentucky bourbon, but it doesn't. The Brown Derby cocktail comes to us from the 1930s in America. It's a West Coast creation, probably made in Hollywood. Those are the earliest notations of the recipe, and it makes sense because there was actually a diner in Hollywood at that time that looked like a baked brown derby, and that's what people claim it was named after. It is classically just 1.5 ounces of bourbon, 3/4 to 1 ounce of grapefruit juice, 1/2 ounce to 3/4 ounce of a honey syrup. It's basic, it's clean, it's simple. It's not the most interesting cocktail in the world, but it is a classic, so I think it's worth noting. And I think it's a great basis. One important thing to note with this cocktail is that I think kind of the gimmick of it is that there's no other citrus outside of the grapefruit. So your grapefruit is both providing some sweetness, but also mainly it's your only source of acidity. So you definitely want to use fresh grapefruit juice for this drink. So what I'm gonna do to kind of gussy up this drink is I'm gonna bring up one of my favorite flavor combinations, which is like cinnamon, absinthe, and grapefruit. Pair that with some honey and some whiskey and it sounds like a winner. So I am going to first rinse my cocktail glass with a little bit of absinthe, just a little bit. Also, we're making a spooky fall cocktail and I don't know, absinthe doesn't have really a reason to be feared. It's just a beautiful spirit, but I think it's got that association. So I'm gonna take advantage of it. So I'm gonna add as my base some allspice dram, just a couple dashes. You could sub an Angostura bitters here if you can't find allspice dram, that's fine. You just want something that's gonna bring you some baking spices. Now next is going to be my sweetener. I'm keeping this pretty close to the original brown derby. I just infused my honey syrup with some rosemary, which was gonna pair great with all this. I love to save the little goofy bear bottles to put my syrups back in. Just for me, it's fun. So just 1/2 ounce, because we're gonna get enough sweetness in other places. I'm gonna use 1.5 ounces of fresh grapefruit juice. This is white grapefruit juice that I happen to be using. Boop. And then lastly, my Buffalo Trace. I'm gonna go ahead and do a 2-ounce pour of this. One of the first lessons I was ever taught in cocktailing from a bar manager many jobs ago was that if you're gonna do a riff on a cocktail, you need to improve it in some way, especially if you're gonna complicate it more. So if you're gonna take a simple drink that works great on its own and add like I just did, I added a bitter, I added a rinse, an infusion. If you're gonna do that, it needs to be better than the final product. And that's hard with a lot of classics because there's so many classics that are delicious and just perfect as they are. So that's what I'm trying to do. And then for a garnish, I'm just going to add a grapefruit twist. Alright, so this is what this is what she looks like. Let's see what she tastes like. So the things that I like about this cocktail, compared to the original brown derby, it has a little bit more complexity. That spice profile coming in from the allspice is really, it's drying it out a little bit, make it a little less sweet, which is really nice. The rosemary adds a nice warmth that weirdly enough brings out the sort of the corn of the whiskey. It has like a really nice roasty flavor to it. And also, you know, it's a little bit more fitting with the season. So yeah, I like it. I like it a lot. Yeah, now we have to, I didn't name the last two and then everybody told me things that I should name it. Colonel Blanton's ghost might be the one that haunts the Buffalo Trace Distillery. So I'm gonna call this the Colonel's Ghost. Cheers to you, Colonel Blanton, and all of the living and no longer living distillers, head distillers at Buffalo Trace. So if you get a chance to go to Buffalo Trace Distillery, they do ghost tours, they do just tasting tours, tasting sessions. It's massive. They produce some of the best spirits, some of the most renowned bourbons in the world. definitely check it out. And if you want to make a spooky fall cocktail at home, the recipe for this, the Colonel's Ghost, will be down below. If you would like to follow us on Twitter or Instagram, we are Neat Boozecast. If you'd like to email us with any questions, comments, concerns, what have you. If you are a ghost and you have opinions, I would love to hear them. It is neattheboozecast@gmail.com. If you would like to join our Patreon, in which we reward you with stickers and coasters and our undying affection for helping us finance the booze we buy on the show, we have a Patreon, so check that out. And lastly, of course, thank you to Absurdist for our music. I hope you all are having a safe but spooky October. And I have been Taylor Smurl, and this has been Neat. If I was ever going to be a ghost, I want to haunt a distillery. That just seems like a good place to be a ghost, right? Like, just people are there, they're excited, they may be a little drunk. I don't know.